From games that are beyond broken to games that feel like they should be more than decades old, but are somehow recent releases. Not all video game releases of the past 10 years have been winners. In fact, many of them have been just the opposite. Welcome back, my fellow gamers. It's me, Amanda. What are some games that you are looking forward to being released in 2023? Hopefully games that aren't the worst. Number 10, Balan Wonderworld. Balan Wonderworld. What is this game, and why did it come out in 2021? Balan Wonderworld is a platformer from Square Enix that, well, it's really confusing. If you thought FPSs were competitive and hard to sell in today's market, I would argue that platformers, while not as common, might be even more so. Because although we have a ton more FPSs coming out every year, we already have Mario for platformers, and it's still one of the best platformers that we have today. So either you have to do something really interesting and revolutionary to have your game succeed, or you need to, I don't know, be the next Mario, which feels impossible. So what was Square Enix's approach with Balan Wonderworld? Well, I'm still not really sure what they were intending to do here. It seems as though they tried to do Mario better, but kinda just failed on that one. Also, the game it's got a weird story, man. It's about a magical man named Balan, who basically takes children into his theater, which is like living in a world that is like fantasy and reality, when their hearts lose balance. Balan's Wonderworld is apparently a place where fantasy and reality combine, inspired by memories and hearts. I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty much a one-for-one summary from Wikipedia in terms of what the heck is going on in this game. So yeah, this was a thing that happened. It was so poorly received, some even compared it to the early 2000s platformers in terms of its gameplay and mechanics, which is pretty savage. I will say, it does look pretty, but Balan looks like such a creep, man. I don't know, I wouldn't trust that guy. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Gaming, why not show us you love us by clicking that subscribe button? Do it! Number 9, Silent Hill Downpour. This was a game that I think a lot of people were actually super hyped for at the time. It just makes it within our decade window of awful games, with it being released in 2012. The sad thing is, many fans were hoping after the disappointment that was Silent Hill Homecoming, that Silent Hill Downpour would be the game to get us back on track to what had made the first 3 Silent Hill games so memorable. Granted, not all to follow those first 3 have been terrible, and even Downpour had, you know, some things going for it, I'd say, but it just couldn't deliver when it came to giving us great combat, a compelling story, and really haunting scares, which is always what fans think back to in terms of how revolutionary the first 3 Silent Hill games felt. So when we get a new Silent Hill game, that's kind of what fans are looking for, and Downpour just didn't have it. Number 8, Final Fantasy XIV. This one ranks a little lower on the list because although the game was so bad that the servers were taken down after the game was launched, ultimately everything got sort of worked out in the end, which I'll tell you that story. But you know it's bad when you launch a game online and you have to remove the servers when you're canceling it? Ooh. Yikes. Final Fantasy XIV was an MMORPG, a massive multiplayer online role-playing game. The initial release for this game was in 2010, which yeah, okay, we're extending the decade by a couple years to talk about this one. But you know, we don't really talk about this MMO, and we don't really talk about MMOs in general on this channel, so I wanted to extend a little bit. And you know, the release of this game was such a fiasco, I think it's earned the extension to make our cut as one of the worst out there. The controls and interface were considered so dismal that the current CEO of Square Enix at the time, Yoichi Wada, offered an official apology to fans. The game had apparently suffered from poor production due to the fact that game developers had misunderstood the importance for MMOs of building a strong foundation in terms of the gameplay itself. They had believed everything could be patched after the fact, so instead had spent much time and effort in perfecting and polishing the graphics, when really they should have been working on some of the other things. 2 years after the game's launch, the servers were all shut down, and in 2013 a new version of the game was released, which had reportedly been developed from scratch in an effort to repair damage done to the brand name by the failure of Final Fantasy XIV, at least the initial release of that. The remake of the game was called Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, how appropriate, and is much much more well received today. And actually today we just call it Final Fantasy XIV. We don't even say A Realm Reborn, but that is what it was. So although this is technically a different game as it was built from scratch, I think that still earns the initial release some brownie points, as at least Square Enix was able to fix the MMORPG by replacing it with a much better one later down the line. So yeah, the first release, the first version of this game was one of the worst, but you know, they brought it back around in the end, and that's what I appreciate about them. Number 7, Homefront: The Revolution. Homefront: The Revolution is a game that is actually part of the Homefront franchise, and the very small franchise, because I think it's only 2 games. And while this game has the word revolution in the title, it apparently was anything but. Homefront: The Revolution was released in 2016 and promised to provide something new, exciting, and fresh to the world of FPS games. Oh, thank goodness, another revolutionary FPS. The game was an open world first-person shooter, and while the world around you was filled with interesting details providing a great atmosphere for players, the gameplay felt monotonous and the story was really predictable and just kind of eh. With a campaign that was meant to take 20 hours, Homefront: The Revolution just did not provide enough for players to actually feel that this amount of time was justified. There just wasn't enough to compel players to, well, keep playing the game. It's unfortunate considering the rich environment that both games in the franchise took place in. I think a lot of people with Homefront were kind of hoping for more, and when the second game came out they're like, oh, redemption time, but then just kind of went the same way as the first Homefront. Number 6, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. Where to start with this game? On paper, it looks promising. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite was following Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which is a much beloved game among the fighting community and fans of the MVC games in general. However, when it comes to what was actually going on with this game, it gets real dark real quick. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite was released in 2017 and promised to deliver on new characters, also changing the model somewhat by introducing Infinity Stones. It also promised 100% new characters from both the sides of Marvel and Capcom. 100% new! Totally not Wolverine but reskinned as Black Panther. And Hawkeye who? That's Monster Hunter, guys. Don't worry about it. Come on. And all the characters you were used to were supposed to be updated as well. Supposed to be. Because pretty much everything that was promised to fans ended up not happening or ended up being disappointing, as these promises were used to kind of mislead players. Advertising innovation while ultimately delivering a lazy and less attractive product in terms of overall design. I mean, just look at what they did to Chun-Li initially. The disrespect. They fixed it, but also, woo, that was rough. Number 5, Infestation: Survivor Stories. This game was so bad that it was renamed in order to make people forget about how bad it was, and to potentially swindle people out of more money, especially as it was available early and many who bought it demanded a refund before the game's official launch date. As a release, the game was renamed to Infestation: Survivor Stories. Well, I feel like a big part of the reasoning for rebranding it was because it had failed so poorly, and the developers claimed there were also some trademark issues with the unrelated film World War Z, which I could see actually being like a legitimate issue, to be fair to them. Infestation is a zombie MMO, which sounds cool on paper, but the gameplay mechanics were just not where they needed to be. Also, there doesn't seem to be any tutorial for this game when I've watched gameplay of it. You just are dropped into it. Welcome. Most MMOs don't do that to you. Other than that, the game was also heavily criticized for implementing microtransactions in order to allow players to skip the 4-hour respawn time after they died in game, which, you know, it's a little shady. But also, now there's microtransactions everywhere, so I feel like today we just feel like, well, Number 4, Saints Row. I have 3 words when it comes to the latest installment to come out for Saints Row in 2022. Too many bugs. Many of the reviews of the game centered around the fact that while there were some things that were actually good about this game, the bugs upon release basically made the game unplayable, which greatly affected how it was scored by critics upon its release. It was also said that the game itself felt like it was from another time period, and that the bugs affected the overall flow of the story from building, leaving the game overall feeling largely disjointed. There are good bones in this game, but the way it was released leaves much to be desired. And unlike Cyberpunk, I'm not sure if there'll be a possible redemption for Saints Row, which doesn't feel like it has the level of writing to bring people back following major patching. I mean, at least with Cyberpunk, the writing, I feel like, has been good since day one. The disappointment fans felt upon playing Saints Row was greatly reflected in its sales upon the game's release. During its first week, it was at the top of the sales charts for physical game copies in the UK, but the following week, sales plummeted by about 80%, causing it to drop dramatically from number 1 to number 6. Ooh, that's not a good sign when you release a game and everybody's buying it and then all of a sudden everyone's like, yeah, I don't think I'm gonna buy that. Number 3, SimCity. You know your game is bad when it actually has to be taken off the market for a few days. That is what happened to the 2013 SimCity game. It was an online city building simulator game where players could build cities that would interact with others, which on paper, it sounds great. But as we've learned from this list, sometimes a great idea on paper does not cut it, especially if it isn't well executed, which is pretty much exactly what happened here. EA and Maxis did not expect the game to be quite as popular, and as a result, the servers for the first few months were overloaded, with players having to wait around 30 minutes on average or more to just jump into a game online. Yeah. The other issue was that this version of SimCity had no offline mode initially and wasn't as freeing when it came to building and maintaining cities in-game. Because of how poorly it was received by players, Amazon even removed the game from their online store temporarily, while EA attempted to work out some of the kinks here. Later, an offline mode was added, but the damage had already been done. The failure that was 2013 SimCity reflected so poorly on EA that it also contributed to them being declared as the worst company in America in a 2013 consumerist poll. Yeah. Yikes. Number 2, Umbrella Corps. You know it's a dismal Resident Evil game when it doesn't even get to have the words Resident Evil in the title. Yeah. Umbrella Corps was intended to be a third-person shooter action horror game. The game, however, was so broken upon its release, with glitchy game mechanics providing most of the horror in this game, as opposed to the actual scares that we're used to from Resident Evil games, that it earned around a 3 out of 10 from most major reviewers, and an even lower average score among actual players. Dang! Even today, Umbrella Corps is currently 75% off at the time of this recording in the Steam shop, meaning that it went from being a $26.99 game here in 2022 for that standard price to being $6.74 right now. Canadian, of course. I'm looking at the Canadian prices on Steam. That is a considerable markdown. And based on what I've heard about Umbrella Corps, I would say that 6 or less actually fits the price point for this game based on what I know of the gameplay. Ratings for the game still haven't recovered despite this game being released in 2016, which tells you how bad it was and likely still is. Number 1, Life of Black Tiger. How did this game even get ported into a console? I ask myself this every morning when I wake up and look in the mirror. How did this happen? Why? Why? Life of Black Tiger, why do you exist? This might not just be one of the worst games of the decade, but indeed one of the worst games of all time. Life of Black Tiger isn't just strange for its concept, where you live the life of a black tiger, teleporting basically around, because every level you're in a totally different place, hunting, even mating, but it's also weird because it's in essence an ancient, by modern gaming standards, fnaf game that was somehow granted a PlayStation console license, which allowed it to be ported over to the PS4, without seemingly much done to improve the game, and begging us all to ask the question of who this PS4 game could have possibly been intended for. Are there tigers that wanted to play this? I have to know. Even in its original form on iOS and Android, Life of Black Tiger was monotonous at best and unplayable at its worst. Although being unable to play this game could actually be seen as a blessing in disguise, because that's how bad it is. This likely has to do with the fact that the game was run using the Unity engine, at the time a notoriously hard engine to run a full game on without putting in a lot of extra work, something Life of Black Tiger doesn't seem to have inspired in regards to the team or the person who worked on it. Also, silly wolves. What are silly wolves? Why do they exist? Well, those are our top 10 worst games for the past decade. Have you played any of these titles? And did you live to tell the tale? And what were your thoughts if you have lived to tell the tale? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep on gaming on. Pew pew!